I'll start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as well. Okay, so there are two main arguments I think that we confront when we're arguing about widespread racism in Australia today. The first is that the problem's the working class. Okay, they fear people who are different. They fear losing on jobs and housing to immigrants, and there are various versions of this, such as it's the working class voters who force politicians to clamp down on refugees, cut immigration, and are also hostile to all this woke nonsense. To turn that around, one of the most common arguments is we need more education. The second argument is that it's because Australia is a settler colonial state, which means that racism has been baked into the culture since 1788. What we need is to decolonise Australia. Now, both arguments actually have an element of truth, but in the end they fail to explain the racism faced by Aboriginal people, people of colour and immigrants. And more importantly, they don't really offer any kind of way forward. If education was the answer, we ought to have already defeated racism. In the early 1970s, which was the high point of anti-racism in Australia, only about 28 to 34% of teenagers completed Year 12. Today, the figure is 81%. Wow. 2% of the adults in the early 1970s had a university degree. 2%. Today, it's something like 33%. Maybe the problem is too much education. No, obviously not. And it's also despite the fact that we know educational materials are far less racist than they were 50 odd years ago. So really that argument doesn't hold any water. But you can see that when talking about educated people are less racist, there's an implication, isn't there, about who is. Okay, what about decolonising Australia? And then the question that raises is, well, what does that actually mean? Indigenous self-determination, centering Indigenous voices, all things that we can agree with. But that perspective also sees white people as benefiting from dispossession and genocide, as well as from the exploitation of the developing world, with only a tiny minority of allies really engaged with decolonisation. It's a perspective that really has no way forward and really drives despair, actually. So actually, what is the socialist argument about racism and the way forward? I think at the centre of it is we understand racism as being a product of the rise of capitalism and driven by the priorities and agendas of the ruling class. So if we take the rise of capitalism, really racism begins with the rise with slavery, with not just with slavery, but modern American slavery, a modern Caribbean slavery, a system that was unbelievably brutal, nothing like traditional slavery, unbelievably brutal, incredibly systematic in the amounts of physical torture and abuse that were used to calculate how much sugar, how much cotton, how much coffee could be extracted from slaves before they died. And this was justified, and a new philosophy, a new argument was developed to legitimise this brutality, which was that Africans, who were the slaves, or the predominant majority of the slaves, Africans were subhuman, they were incapable, they were lazy, they were incapable of science, they were only capable of animal responses, and so on. And this ideology of racism, which was developed with slavery, and which also, incidentally, was used to legitimise slavery in Britain at a time when the actual ruling class in Britain was developing modern capitalist relations of production, which were based on, the so-called freedom of the worker, completely the opposite of slavery. The worker was free. They were free to choose their employer if they could find one. They were, when they left work, they were no longer under the hammer of the boss. They were given a wage. They were free to spend their wage in return for their labour. They were given a wage. They were free to spend it anywhere they chose. They could choose bread, or they could choose whatever else. They could choose where to live. They could choose what to wear, what to buy. They could choose to buy alcohol. right? And then, of course, they had to be ready to go to work the next day. So along with this freedom went the demand that they were self-disciplined. If they educated themselves, they could perhaps get a better job, and so on. And that cut right against slavery. And so there was a conflict over the slavery system, and the slave owners used racism to legitimise slavery in the eyes of the capitalists. And of course, then it was also used to legitimise colonisation. I'm sure everybody is aware of the way slavery was used to legitimise colonisation. But just for fun, I thought I would turn to the Sydney Morning Herald from the 17th of May, 1873. And this is, the Sydney Morning Herald at the time is the mouthpiece of the mercantile bourgeoisie in New South Wales, the pastoralists, hates unions, hates the working class, right? And in this editorial, it's musing about colonisation. It's talking about how the great genius of the British people is their genius for colonisation, genius for spreading civilisation. And then starts to think about, well, what about New Guinea? Right, it's just up there. We've got to do something about New Guinea. What are we going to do about New Guinea? Do we want to... They basically said there's two things we can do. We can take over New Guinea and discipline the natives, right? Or we have to replace them with the industrious Chinese. They're the two alternatives. So if displacing the original inhabitants and replacing them with industrious Chinese is necessary, this is what we need to do. By studying all the little tribal wars, by judiciously playing upon local prejudices between the local people, by arming both sides, it would be possible in a comparatively short space of time to arrange for the inhabitants to kill each other off. So that's the ideology of colonialism spread, that dominated the British Empire, but actually dominated our rulers as well. That's how they thought about colonised people and about people that they're going to exploit. So that's really the origins, talking there about the origins of racism in general and in the British Empire. But I want to turn to talk about racism in Australia and the specific roots of the specific forms that racism has taken in Australia. And the first is anti-Aboriginal racism. Now again, I don't think it will be any news to anyone in this room that anti-Aboriginal racism begins in 1788 because resistance to British invasion begins in 1788. And the resistance of Aboriginal people to dispossession and then to the murders that took place in order that the pastoralists could get the land of Aboriginal people, a whole suite of ideas about Aboriginal inferiority, how they were really a throwback, they couldn't possibly survive in the modern era because they just completely lacked the capacity to do it. They lacked the capacity for systematic labour and so on. A whole range of racist ideas about their savagery, their customs and so on, legitimised a genocide, which continues to this day. But the next two, I think, are, in a sense, perhaps there might be some new bits, so we'll go into those. The second really significant racist movement in Australia was the anti-Irish racism. Hardly talked about today. But the Irish people were both a benefit and a problem for the Australian ruling class. The ruling class was desperate to colonise the territory. They wanted more people farming, they wanted more labourers working for pastoralists, they wanted to build up a bigger modern economy as quickly as possible. And so Irish people could play that role. And it was easy to get Irish people to migrate to Australia because the British Empire had engaged in one of the most catastrophic genocides in Ireland in the 1840s, when during a potato famine, potato blight, when the potato crop failed, the British landlords were shipping food out of Ireland. over 1 million Irish out of 8 million died. 1 million more fled Ireland to escape the poverty into Britain, and many went to the United States and, of course, to Australia. So the ruling class here could get Irish workers, Irish labourers. There was a problem, which is, of course, that the Irish had many ideas that were inimical to the British Empire. They were rebellious. They wanted independence. So you get from, and then of course in 1868, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Alfred, comes for a visit to Australia. And a supporter of Irish independence, who was a little bit, not entirely rational, decided that they were going to kill the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's son. They didn't succeed in killing him, but what they did succeed is unleashing, giving the ruling class the excuse to unleash this incredible anti-Irish pogrom, if you like, this attack on Irish people. So by the mid-1870s, the loyal Orange Lodges, this is the kind of militant, hysterical, racist movement of Protestants, in New South Wales had 19,000 members in a population of about 600,000. If they had that equivalent in Australia today, that would be like a racist movement of 900,000 people. That's how big it was. There was over 1,000 separate branches of the Loyal Orange Lodge. I could go through all the racist... Here we go. This is one of Australia's leading intellectuals on the Irish. You find them in the lowest and unhealthiest back slums of the great cities, congregated together in misery and squalor. They form an Irish quarter which becomes at once a hotbed of crime disorder. Wherever they go, they carry with them the same turbulent lawlessness, low, treacherous cunning, lazy and thriftless habits, and degraded standard of material comfort, and so on and so on. That was the attitude. This was not exceptional. This was one of the leading intellectuals in Australia, a character called Top, A.M. Top. And so the significance of the anti-Irish movement was to do two things. One was to have Germanised the majority of the working class to support the British Empire and to oppose everything about the Catholic Church and the Catholic Irish. And of course it also had the effect of attempting to divide the working class. So there were attempts to set up Protestant trade unions. They failed. But anti-Catholic racism was still significant to the mid-1970s in Australia. The mid-1970s. Right? There were hardly any Catholics in the Liberal Party. There were a lot of Catholic capitalists. They joined the Labor Party because they were welcome in the Labor Party. The Liberal Party didn't want to know them. The only thing which changed that was when the political party that the rich Catholics set up, which was called the Democratic Labor Party, collapsed in 1974. And so then you started to get a genuine Catholic bourgeois element in the Liberal Party, exemplified by people like, dare I use the name, Tony Abbott. So there's the anti-Irish racism. The third important racism which we have in Australia, of course, is anti-coloured racism, anti-Chinese, anti-Islander, anti-Indian. And the ruling class were hostile to Chinese immigrants for two main reasons. The first was that while China was incredibly poor and weak, they also feared a future in which the Chinese Empire had become powerful and well armed. They were 100 years out, or 130 years out by that, but that's what they feared. And they feared that a Chinese population in Australia, a significant Chinese population, could be a fifth column, a means by which the Chinese Empire could influence politics in Australia. A strategic agenda. The second concern they had was this. They believed that to build a stable and strong politics that they controlled, they needed what they called a homogenous population. A population that looked the same, shared a common culture and so on. And the Chinese, they argued, could not be assimilated. Actually today, almost everything that's said, like on these lines about Chinese people, you can see applying to other communities as well, Muslims and so on. So there was a strategic and a social control agenda involved in this anti-Chinese racism. By the time of Federation, when the White Australia policy was introduced, the strategic concern was now focused on Japan, which was now becoming a major military force in the region rather than against China and Chinese people. Now, the argument that's made about the White Australia policy and also about racism in general is that the working class benefited. So I just want to take a minute or two to say something about that. In the United States, there's been a range of work done by some very good Marxists, one of whose name was Albert Zemansky. Albert Zemansky looked at what was the situation of white workers in the American South, where racism was at its worst, and what was the situation of white and black workers in America's North. And what he found was this: black workers in the North earned more money than white workers in the South. Not just black workers, white workers in the South. So wherever the racial gap in pay was small, white workers were better off. Black workers were a lot better off. Actually, the same applied to a study done with Northern Ireland. Catholics in England earned more money than Protestants in Northern Ireland. Not just Catholics in Northern Ireland, Protestants in Northern Ireland. And the reason is simple: because racism destroys and undermines the class solidarity that is fundamental to actually winning decent wages, decent working conditions, and so on. But in Australia, not only is it completely untrue that it was the working class that drove white Australia, but there's a whole series of ways that working class illusions in white Australia harmed them. So, for instance, one of the great enemies of the working class in 19th century Australia was the long-time Premier of New South Wales, Sir Henry Parkes. He hated trade unions, but he also hated Chinese immigration. And when he moved to pass a law against Chinese immigration, the unions congratulated him. What was the reward? Within a year, his government had sent field artillery, right, the military with cannon, to Newcastle to suppress a miners' strike. McIlwraith, the Premier of Queensland, a champion of stopping Chinese immigration. Again, the unions congratulated him and thanked him for caring for their interests. Within a couple of years, McIlwraith had used the army to suppress the Great Shearers' Strike, put their leaders in chains and taken them off to an island prison. That was the reward the workers got. Okay, so I'm going to have to move along. I think that I want to just say one very brief thing. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism saw a massive rise in racism in Australia. Why? Because it dramatically increased the level of alienation between workers. So workers have a double existence in capitalism. We are divided, and so that division creates the grounds on which the idea is that you have to look after yourself, you have to look after your own group, and it's the thing that opens workers up to racism. But the other side of workers' existence is collective production, and collective production is the material basis for trade unionism, trade union struggle, solidarity, and overcoming those divisions. And so neoliberalism, which saw greater alienation, privatisation, the weakening of trade unions, the massive loss of trade union members, the complete collapsing union militancy from trade union leaders and so on, opened the door to racism and opened the door to Hanson and her mob. The way we beat racism, it has two elements, and we need both of them. The first element is a revival of class struggle. The second is a mass conscious anti-racist movement. We cannot we cannot just have one and expect to defeat racism. Now, obviously, today it's easier for us to build an anti-racist movement, right? Because you don't need to have the majority of workers in a workplace, right? It's a political discussion, and an anti-racist movement can also influence the politics of the unions of the working class. But at the end of the day, without that revival of basic class struggle, fighting the boss, seeing the common interests across all nationalities within the working class, all the good anti-racist politics in the world are not going to be enough. And obviously, it's the final end of that process of class struggle and political struggle and ideological struggle that holds the hope for getting rid of racism altogether, which is, of course, a revolution against capitalism as a system.